The scent of stale coffee and old grease was the first thing Ilara Vance knew in the morning and the last thing she clung to at night. At 22, her life was a series of repetitive motions inside a forgotten, greasy spoon diner on the frayed edge of the financial district. Her hands, stained with the ghost of 1,000 spilled coffees, moved with a quiet, weary grace, refilling mugs and clearing plates in a ballet of practiced efficiency. She was a ghost in her own story, her presence as faded as the checkered linoleum floor. Her slender frame carried the weight of dreams she'd long since packed away, and her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a profound stillness, a silent testament to a life lived on the sidelines, observing but never truly participating. She existed in the quiet spaces, a footnote in the bustling narrative of the city. Will this silent girl ever find a voice, or is she destined to remain a prisoner of her own quiet world? I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. We continue. At night, in the cramped apartment she shared with the gentle, rattling breaths of her ailing grandmother, Ilara shed her waitress uniform like a second skin. Here, in the soft glow of a single desk lamp, she became a creator of worlds. Her sketchbooks were her only true confidants, their pages filled with sprawling, fantastical landscapes and faces brimming with emotions she herself was too afraid to feel. Vibrant hues of crimson and gold bled across the paper, a stark, defiant contrast to the monochrome reality of her days. This was her secret rebellion, a fierce, private world where she was not a waitress, but an architect of beauty. Yet, she guarded these books with a ferocity born of fear, convinced that to show them to anyone would be to watch them crumble into dust, just like every other fragile hope she had ever dared to entertain. Her virginity was not a choice born of faith or romantic idealism, but a fortress she had meticulously constructed around her heart. It was a self-imposed exile, a vow of emotional abstinence inherited from the ruins of her mother's life. Her mother had been a woman who chased starlight, only to be consumed by its fire, dazzled, and ultimately broken by a wealthy man who saw her as a beautiful, fleeting amusement. Ilara grew up in the long shadow of that heartbreak, learning that passion was a prelude to ruin, and that the touch of a powerful man was a brand, not a caress. So she built her walls high, believing her heart was a fragile heirloom, too precious and too easily shattered to be offered to a world that specialized in breaking beautiful things. She chose emptiness over the risk of being emptied. The apartment was a sanctuary and a prison, smelling of lavender-scented laundry soap, her grandmother's medicinal tea, and the slow decay of time. Every creak of the floorboards was a reminder of the bills stacked on the small kitchen table, each one a link in the chain that bound her to the diner. Her grandmother, with her paper-thin skin and eyes that still held a glimmer of youthful mischief, was the anchor of Ilara's world. Tending to her was an act of profound love, but also a constant, pressing weight. The money from her tips, counted out each night with trembling fingers, was a lifeline that felt perpetually frayed. It was a life of careful measurements, of medicine, of money, of hope. Ilara felt the suffocating smallness of it all, a love so vast it threatened to drown her in its demands. Back at the diner, the world was a blur of indifferent faces. Men in sharp suits barked orders, their eyes sliding past her as if she were part of the furniture. Women with perfectly manicured nails complained about the temperature of their soup, oblivious to the girl whose hands were chapped and sore from washing dishes. Her boss, a man with a perpetually sour expression, watched her every move, his presence a constant, low-grade hum of disapproval. The diner was a microcosm of her life, a place where she served the needs of others while her own went hungry. She moved through the clatter and the chatter, a silent observer in a soundproof bubble, her own thoughts the only company she kept. She had perfected the art of being invisible, a skill that protected her but also slowly erased her. Sometimes, during a lull in the lunch rush, she would stand by the large grease-smeared window and stare at the glass and steel monoliths that pierced the sky in the distance. They were symbols of another world, a universe of power, wealth, and freedom she could only imagine. It felt as distant as the fantastical cities in her sketchbooks. A deep, hollow ache would settle in her chest, a longing for something she couldn't name. It was the quiet, persistent grief for the life she hadn't lived, for the woman she could have been if fear hadn't become the architect of her existence. She felt trapped between two worlds, the one she was forced to inhabit, and the one she was too terrified to build, leaving her stranded in a perpetual soul-crushing twilight. As her shift ended, the sky opened up, releasing a cold, relentless rain that mirrored the quiet melancholy of her soul. The city lights blurred into watercolor streaks against the wet asphalt, a beautiful chaos she could only view from behind a pane of glass. She pulled her thin coat tighter around herself, a futile gesture against the encroaching chill that seemed to emanate from within. Ilara Vance had no way of knowing that this was not just another Tuesday evening. She was unaware that the storm washing over the city was a harbinger of a different kind of tempest, a silent, powerful man who was at that very moment walking toward the dim, flickering lights of her diner, destined to shatter the fragile peace of her carefully constructed world. Her life of quiet resignation was about to end. The journey home was a descent. Ilara walked away from the glittering spires of the financial district, each step taking her deeper into the city's forgotten corners, where the streetlights sputtered and the buildings hunched together for warmth. The air, thick with the scent of rain on hot asphalt and exhaust fumes, clung to her clothes. This was the other side of the looking glass, a world of cracked pavement, shuttered storefronts, and the weary faces of people who, like her, were running just to stand still. Her apartment building loomed ahead, a brick-and-mortar testament to forgotten dreams, its fire escapes zigzagging like scars against its weathered facade. She felt the invisible line she crossed every evening, the one that separated the world of power and possibility from her own reality of quiet, grinding subsistence. It was a border she had never been able to breach. Inside, the apartment was a tiny, meticulously kept world defined by the soft, rhythmic rasp of her grandmother's breathing from the next room. It was a sound that was both a comfort and a cage. Every object held the weight of history. The worn floral armchair where her grandmother spent her days, the chipped teacups, the faint, lingering scent of camphor and lavender. Her grandmother, Eleanor, was a woman woven from gentle strength and quiet regrets. Her love for Ilara was a palpable, enveloping force, but it was also a tether. "A pretty girl like you," she would often say, her voice a fragile whisper, "shouldn't be wasting her life in that place. You need a good, steady man to look after you." Each word was a loving, well-intentioned brick in the wall being built around Ilara's future. The ghost of her mother was a permanent resident in their small home. A single, silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece was the only shrine. In it, a young woman with Ilara's eyes laughed with a reckless, joyful abandon that seemed almost alien. This was her mother before the fall, before the wealthy man who had promised her the world had instead shown her its edge and let her drop. "He was like a prince from a storybook," Eleanor would recount, her voice tinged with a bitterness that time had failed to dull. "And he treated your mother like a storybook princess until he got tired of the story." The lesson was hammered into Ilara's soul with every telling. Love from that world was a poison, served in a crystal glass, a beautiful illusion designed to shatter the unwary. The financial pressure was a physical entity, a constant, low thrum of anxiety that lived in the base of her skull. Every evening she'd sit at the small kitchen table, under the flickering fluorescent light, and perform the nightly ritual. She would smooth out the crumpled dollar bills from her tips, her fingers tracing the stern faces of forgotten presidents, and stack the coins into neat, precarious towers. Beside her lay the pile of envelopes, each one a demand: rent, electricity, and the most menacing of all, the pharmacy bill for her grandmother's heart medication. This small pile of cash was the dam holding back a flood of disaster. She felt the crushing weight of every single coin, the responsibility a lead blanket that smothered the very air she tried to breathe, leaving no room for dreams. The outside world echoed her grandmother's sentiments with a harsher, more judgmental tone. Her Aunt Carol, her mother's sister, would call every Sunday, her voice a sharp instrument of familial duty and disapproval. "Still at that greasy spoon, Ilara? You're 22, not a teenager. A woman. Needs security. You think your art is going to pay for Eleanor's medicine?" The questions were not questions, but accusations. "Your problem is you have your mother's looks, but none of her ambition. She at least aimed high. You're not even aiming." Ilara would listen, her knuckles white as she gripped the phone, the words solidifying her sense of failure. She was being measured against a life she desperately wanted to avoid, yet her own inertia and fear made her feel complicit in her own stagnation, a willing prisoner in a cell of her own making. This oppressive atmosphere seeped into her art, staining the edges of her imagination. She would open her sketchbook, intending to create a world of impossible sunsets and crystalline cities, only to find her hand hesitating. The vibrant colors in her pastel set seemed to mock the muted grays and browns of her reality. How could she draw creatures of boundless freedom when she felt so utterly caged? The lines would come out tight and, controlled, the faces of her characters etched with a familiar, weary sorrow. Her art, once a sanctuary, was becoming just another room in her prison. It was a mirror, reflecting the life she was desperate to escape, a constant, vivid reminder of the chasm between the world she could dream and the one she was forced to inhabit every single day. A specific memory often surfaced, unbidden, sharp, and clear as broken glass. She was 8 years old, hiding behind the living room door. Her mother was on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of a shattered vase, weeping with a raw, guttural agony that terrified Ilara. She was clutching a diamond necklace, the last gift from the man who had left her. With a sudden, violent scream, her mother had thrown the necklace against the wall, where it broke apart, the diamonds scattering across the floor like frozen tears. "They're just pretty stones," she had sobbed, her words slurring. "They can't buy back your soul, Ilara. Never let them buy your soul." That image was burned into her mind, the glittering, meaningless stones on the worn carpet, and the sound of her mother's heart breaking. The act of caregiving was a relentless, cyclical dance of duty and love. Mornings began with the careful administration of pills, the sweet, chalky smell of medication, a permanent fixture in the air. She would help her grandmother bathe, her own strong, young hands gentle on the fragile, paper-thin skin. She'd cook simple, soft foods, read aloud from novels, whose pages were worn thin with 100 readings, and listen to the same stories of a life lived long ago. While her love for Eleanor was the truest, most profound thing in her life, the routine was a slow, creeping erosion of her own identity. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a caregiver, a waitress. The part of her that was just Ilara, the artist, the dreamer, was shrinking with each passing day, starved of light and air. One afternoon, while walking home, a brightly colored flyer caught her eye, taped to a lamppost. It advertised evening classes at the Community Art Institute, life drawing, oil painting, sculpture. For a dizzying moment, a wild, unfamiliar surge of hope coursed through her. She imagined herself in a sunlit studio, the smell of turpentine in the air, her hands covered in clay or paint. She carefully peeled the flyer from the post and folded it, her heart pounding with a forgotten excitement. But by the time she reached her apartment, the hope had curdled into a familiar, bitter ache. The cost of the class, while modest, was a fortune she didn't have. It was another door, another world locked to her. She slipped the flyer into her sketchbook, a paper tombstone for yet another dead dream. As night fell, she stood by her bedroom window, gazing out at the sprawling, indifferent city. The distant towers of the financial district were a constellation of cold, artificial stars, a universe away from her reality. The feeling of being trapped was no longer a sharp, acute pain, but a dull, chronic condition she had learned to live with. She was a ship built for a vast ocean, yet she was permanently moored in a small, shrinking harbor by anchors of duty, fear, and circumstance. She saw the path laid out before her, years folding into decades within the four walls of the diner and this apartment, her vibrancy fading until she became as much a ghost as her mother. A profound sense of resignation washed over her, a quiet acceptance that this was all her life would ever be. He arrived like a whisper of the storm outside, a figure of stark, severe lines against the diner's warm, greasy haze. The bell above the door announced his entrance with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely inappropriate for the man who stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in a dark, exquisitely tailored suit that was now soaked through with rain, clinging to his broad shoulders in a way that suggested immense, coiled strength. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, his dark hair slicked back from a high forehead. But it was his eyes that held Ilara captive from behind the counter. They were the color of slate, cold and empty, yet they seemed to be surveying the cheap diner not with disdain, but with a kind of desperate, searching emptiness, as if he were a ghost looking for a place to rest. He chose the farthest booth, sliding into the cracked vinyl seat with a fluid grace that was utterly alien to the worn-out space. He didn't glance at the plastic-coated menu or the specials scrawled on the chalkboard. Instead, he stared out the rain-streaked window, his reflection a pale, haunted mask superimposed over the city's blurred lights. Ilara felt an involuntary shiver, a strange pull of recognition. It wasn't him she recognized, but the profound, hermetic solitude that radiated from him like a physical chill. He was a man surrounded by a wall of glass, and she, a lifelong resident of her own invisible fortress, knew the architecture of such a prison intimately. She saw a loneliness in him so vast and absolute, it seemed to eclipse his obvious wealth and power, making him look startlingly vulnerable. Gathering her courage, she approached his table, her notepad clutched in her hand. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He finally turned his gaze from the window, and the full force of his attention felt like a physical impact. His eyes were even colder up close, intelligent and unnervingly perceptive. "Coffee black and a steak, medium rare," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, devoid of any warmth or inflection, a sound that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. He dismissed her with a slight nod, turning back to the window as if she had already ceased to exist. Yet, Ilara could feel the ghost of his gaze on her as she walked away, a silent, analytical weight that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. He did not eat. The steak sat on its plate, a perfect untouched offering, its juices slowly congealing in the diner's lukewarm air. He simply nursed the black coffee, his long, elegant fingers wrapped around the thick ceramic mug as if it were a lifeline. From her vantage point behind the counter, Ilara found herself watching him, unable to look away. He was a paradox she couldn't solve. Men like him, the ones who strode past the diner's window every day, were usually wired, their energy a frantic buzz of phone calls and urgent meetings. This man was the opposite. He was a vortex of stillness, a black hole of quiet intensity that drew all the energy of the room into itself. She felt a dangerous, burgeoning curiosity about the story behind that impenetrable facade, about the wounds that had forged such a man of steel and shadow. Finally, he caught her eye and gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, signaling for the check. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the table again. He produced a credit card from an inner pocket of his suit jacket. It was made of a heavy, matte black metal, devoid of any numbers, bearing only his name, Damian Blackwood. The name sent a jolt through her. Even in her cloistered world, she had heard of him, the ghost of Wall Street, a ruthless, reclusive mogul. She took the card, its cold weight feeling sinister in her palm, and ran it through the ancient, sputtering machine. The machine whirred, then beeped, a shrill, ugly sound. On the small screen, a single, brutal word, flashed in stark red letters, declined. The word seemed to hang in the air, an impossible, universe-altering glitch. A suffocating silence descended upon the diner. Her boss, Mr. Henderson, a man who could smell financial distress like a shark smells blood, was instantly at her side. "Is there a problem with the payment?" he asked, his voice oily but loud, deliberately drawing the attention of the few remaining patrons. Damian Blackwood's expression remained a mask of impenetrable calm, but Ilara, a connoisseur of hidden pain, saw the truth. It was a subtle, almost invisible tightening around his eyes, a fractional clenching of his jaw. It wasn't the fury of a powerful man being inconvenienced. It was the deep, weary shame of a man being exposed. His armor cracked open for the world to see his utter isolation. In that moment, he wasn't a billionaire. He was just a man, alone and cornered. Everything her mother had taught her, every wall she had built, crumbled in that instant. The fear of men like him, the warnings against their casual cruelty, all of it evaporated, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it was physically painful. She saw past the $1,000 suit and the mythical reputation to the wounded core of him, a core that mirrored her own. The small, precious roll of bills in her apron pocket, the money for her grandmother's heart medication, suddenly felt like a burning coal. A choice, reckless and utterly insane, bloomed in her mind, a choice to step outside the fortress of her fear. and meet his vulnerability with her own, to commit an act of kindness in a world that had shown her so little of it. Before Mr. Henderson could utter another humiliating word, Ilara moved. "It's fine. I've got it," she said, her voice a quiet but firm anchor in the tense silence. She turned her back on Damien, deliberately shielding him from her boss's predatory gaze. Her hands, shaking only slightly, pulled the crumpled bills from her pocket. She smoothed them. Out on the counter, the worn faces of presidents a silent testament to her sacrifice. She counted out the exact amount, the entire week's earnings, her grandmother's lifeline. The quiet rustle of the cash was the only sound, a soft, definitive act of defiance. She was paying for his meal, but it felt as if she were paying a ransom for a piece of his soul, and perhaps a piece of her own. She placed the signed receipt slip on the counter in front of him, her gaze fixed on the worn formica. "It's all taken care of," she murmured, not daring to look up. But she felt his eyes on her, and the intensity of his stare was a physical force that compelled her to lift her head. His cold, slate-grey eyes were locked on hers, and for the first time, they were not empty. They were filled with a raw, turbulent mixture of shock, confusion, and a startling, unguarded astonishment. It was as if she had spoken to him in a language he had long forgotten, but his soul still recognized. In that profound, silent exchange, a fragile, terrifying bridge was built across the chasm that separated their two worlds. He didn't speak. He simply held her gaze for a beat longer, a silent question, or perhaps a warning, passing between them. Then he picked up the pen, his signature a sharp, aggressive slash of ink across the paper. He rose to his full height, a towering shadow in the dim light of the diner. Without a backward glance at Mr. Henderson or the other gawking customers, he turned and walked out, disappearing back into the rainy night from which he came. Ilara stood frozen, the faint, clean scent of rain and expensive wool lingering in the air. Her pocket was empty, her grandmother's security gone. She had just committed an act of unbelievable charity for the one kind of man she had sworn to never trust. The day after he vanished, the rain had stopped, but the city felt washed out, drained of color. Ilara moved through her shift at the diner in a daze, the emptiness in her apron pocket a constant nagging reminder of her reckless act. She was replaying the shocked, unreadable expression in Damien Blackwood's eyes when the diner door opened, and the world seemed to stop. He stood there, not in a rain-soaked suit, but in a perfectly tailored charcoal coat, his presence so immense and out of place, it seemed to warp the very air around him. He ignored her gaping boss and the sudden silence of the patrons, his slate-grey eyes finding hers across the room. He walked directly to her, his step silent and deliberate, and stopped just before the counter, creating an invisible, charged space that only the two of them occupied. He hadn't come to repay a debt. He had come to collect on one she didn't know she had offered. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice was low, a private thunder in the quiet diner. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Vance." He spoke the words as if they were moves in a complex chess game. He explained his situation with a brutal, dispassionate clarity, a corporate battle, a need to project an image of stability, of being a man with ties to the world. He needed a fiancée. He laid out the terms with the precision of a surgeon. Her grandmother would receive the best medical care money could buy for the rest of her life. A trust would be established to fund Ilara's art education at any institution she chose. In return, she would belong to him in public, for as long as he required. It was not a request. It was a transaction, a purchase of her life, offered on a silver platter that felt as cold and heavy as a gravestone. The world tilted on its axis. Ilara could hear the ghost of her mother's sobs, the memory of shattered diamonds on a worn carpet. This was it. This was the devil her mother had warned her about. Not a charming prince, but a cold, calculating king, offering a gilded cage. Every instinct, every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to throw his impossible offer back in his face. But then, an image of her, grandmother's frail, sleeping form, her breath shallow and labored, filled her mind. She saw the stack of unpaid medical bills on her kitchen table. This wasn't just about her fear or her mother's past. It was about her grandmother's future. He was offering a lifeline wrapped in the very chains she had spent her life trying to avoid. The choice was between her soul and her grandmother's life, a cruel, impossible equation. She looked into his eyes, searching for a hint of manipulation, of malice, but found only a profound, chilling emptiness, the same void she had recognized that first night. He was not a monster. He was something far more terrifying, a man hollowed out by his own past, using his power to build a fortress around the empty space where his heart should be. In that moment, she understood that they were both prisoners, albeit of very different circumstances. A quiet, fatalistic resolve settled over her. "I accept," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. A flicker of something. Surprise, disappointment, crossed his features for a fraction of a second before the mask of indifference slammed back down. He simply nodded, as if closing a multi-billion-dollar deal. The contract was sealed not with ink, but with the quiet death of her carefully guarded freedom. The transition was immediate and brutal. The next day, she was whisked away from the world of grease and cracked linoleum into a universe of sterile luxury. He took her to a series of exclusive, appointment-only boutiques where silent, judgmental women dressed her like a doll. The fabrics were impossibly soft, the cuts severe and elegant. She felt the weight of the price tags like stones in her pockets. This wasn't a fairy tale transformation. It was a systematic erasure of Ilara Vance, the waitress. With each new dress, each pair of agonizingly high heels, she felt herself disappearing, replaced by a polished, beautiful stranger. Damien watched the entire process with a detached, analytical gaze, his eyes assessing her not with admiration, but with the cool appraisal of an artist judging his creation, ensuring she would perfectly fit the frame he had built for her. Their first public appearance was a charity gala held in a museum, a cavernous space of marble and glass, where people mingled like elegant predatory sharks. Ilara felt a profound sense of vertigo, a girl from the city's forgotten edge, suddenly thrust among its glittering elite. She clung to Damien's arm, the solid muscle beneath the fine wool of his tuxedo, her only anchor in the swirling tide of champagne and whispered conversations. He moved through the crowd with an easy, commanding grace, a king in his natural habitat. She was his shadow, his beautiful, silent accessory. She could feel the curious, dismissive glances of other women, their eyes cataloguing her dress, her jewelry, her very existence, and finding her wanting. She had never felt more invisible or more painfully exposed in her entire life. The attack came without warning. A rival of Damien's, a man with a cruel smile and predatory eyes named Marcus Thorne, cornered them near a towering sculpture. "Blackwood," he sneered, his gaze sliding over Ilara with blatant contempt. "I never took you for the type to rescue strays. Where did you find this one, a downtown diner?" The insult was designed to pierce Damien's armor by devaluing his possession. Ilara froze, the humiliation a hot flush that spread up her neck. She expected Damien to respond with his signature icy calm, a cutting remark that would end the conversation. She expected him to treat it as a business annoyance. She was wrong. A change came over him, a shift in the atmosphere so sudden and violent it was almost visible. A low, dangerous sound, something akin to a growl, rumbled in Damien's chest. He didn't raise his voice. He lowered it. "The next words you speak about her, Marcus," he said, the tone soft but laced with the promise of absolute ruin, "will be your last in this city." He took a half-step forward, subtly shielding Ilara with his body. His hand, which had been resting lightly on her back, tightened, the heat of his palm a searing brand through the thin silk of her dress. It was an act of pure, undiluted possession. In that moment, he wasn't a businessman protecting an asset. He was a predator protecting his territory. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, terrified bird. She was caught between fear of the man beside her and a dizzying, traitorous thrill at being the object of such fierce, untamed protection. Without another word, he steered her away, his grip on her arm unrelenting. He led her through a set of glass doors and out onto a deserted stone terrace overlooking a manicured garden. The cool night air was a shock to her heated skin. The distant sounds of the gala faded, leaving them in a tense, echoing silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets. He finally released her, turning away, to pace the length of the terrace like a caged panther. The cold, controlled mask was gone, replaced by a raw, turbulent anger that seemed to radiate from him in waves. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. He was fighting for a control that, for the first time, seemed to be slipping from his grasp. She had breached his defenses in a way no corporate rival ever could. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing in the moonlight. He stalked toward her, backing her up against the cold, unyielding stone of the balustrade. He placed his hands on the stone on either side of her, trapping her. "Do you see now?" he rasped, his voice raw with an emotion she couldn't name. "This is the world you've stepped into. It's not a game." He was close, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his skin beneath the expensive cologne. He lowered his head, his gaze dropping to her lips. The anger in his eyes was warring with something else, something darker and more desperate. It was raw, unvarnished hunger. A tremor went through her, a terrifying cocktail of fear and a deep, burgeoning desire that she had never known she was capable of feeling. The world narrowed to the space between their lips. He leaned in, closing the final inch, his breath a warm caress against her mouth. She could feel the tremble in his hands as he braced himself against the stone. Her own eyes fluttered shut, her body instinctively arching toward his, a silent, unconditional surrender. This was it, the moment of ruin, the fall her mother had always warned her about. And yet, all she felt was a desperate, aching need to be consumed by it, to feel, just for a second, the fire she had always been so afraid of. She waited for the pressure of his mouth on hers, for the kiss that would shatter the last of her defenses and irrevocably seal their dangerous, unspoken pact. It was a precipice, and she was more than ready to fall. But the kiss never came. With a ragged, guttural curse, he pushed himself away from her, stumbling back as if he'd been burned. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it for the first time, a sign of the chaos raging within him. "This can't happen," he bit out, the words directed more at himself than at her. "This is a contract, nothing more." The cold, cruel reminder was like a physical blow, a dousing of ice water on the fire he had just ignited. The vulnerability vanished, replaced once again by the steel walls of Damian Blackwood, the ghost of Wall Street. He had looked over the edge of the precipice with her, and, terrified by the view, had chosen to retreat back to the safety of his own desolate prison, leaving her alone and trembling on the brink. The aftermath of that night settled into a tense, unbearable quiet. The near kiss had created a new, unspoken language between them, a current of electricity that arced in the space they shared. Ilara found her, thoughts consumed by him, replaying the moment on the terrace, the raw need in his eyes, the warmth of his breath. The fear she had harbored for a lifetime was being steadily, terrifyingly replaced by a yearning so profound it felt like a physical ache in her chest. She was beginning to desire the very thing she was supposed to be immune to, the touch of a powerful, broken man. Her body and heart were betraying every lesson she had ever learned, drawn to the beautiful, dangerous flame she knew could utterly destroy her. Damien, for his part, retreated even further. He became a ghost in his own home, communicating through clipped, formal notes left with his staff. He avoided being in the same room with her, orchestrating their public appearances with militaristic precision, ensuring they were never alone. Yet she saw the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. She would catch him watching her from across a room, his gaze intense and unguarded, a turbulent sea of conflict and longing before he would notice her looking and quickly school his features back into a mask of cold indifference. He was a man at war with himself, and she was the unwilling, yet increasingly complicit cause of his internal battle. He was trying desperately to resist her, but his involvement was no longer a choice, it was a fact. One rainy afternoon, she wandered into his home library, a vast, silent room that felt like the heart of his fortress. She found him there, not working, but standing, before a fireplace, staring at a small silver-framed photograph of a woman with a vibrant, joyful smile. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his guard completely down. "She designed this house," he said suddenly, his voice quiet and rough with unshed grief. "She believed every home should have a heart." He didn't say more, but he didn't have to. Ilara saw the source of his wound, the ghost that truly haunted him. In that shared moment of quiet vulnerability, surrounded by the silence of his grief, a new fragile thread of understanding was woven between them, deeper and more dangerous than any physical desire. The dilemma was no longer a simple matter of safety versus desire. It had become a complex, agonizing moral crisis. Her grandmother was thriving, her laughter echoing through the comfortable rooms of the private care facility during their weekly calls. Ilara had her own sun-drenched studio in Damien's penthouse, filled with the finest art supplies. She had security. She had opportunity. She had everything she thought she wanted, but she felt like a beautiful, well-kept plant in a glass terrarium, slowly forgetting the feeling of the sun and rain. She was losing control, not to his power, but to her own burgeoning feelings. The greatest danger was not that he would break her heart, but that she was handing it over, piece by piece, to a man who had walled his own off from the world. Gathering a courage she didn't know she possessed, she finally confronted him late one evening. She found him in his office, the city lights a glittering, indifferent backdrop. "This arrangement," she began, her voice shaking but clear. "It's not working." He looked up from his papers, his expression unreadable. "I need to know what you really want from me, Damien. Not what the contract says. What you want." She was no longer the timid waitress from the diner. She was a woman demanding an emotional truth from a man who had built his empire on avoiding it. She was challenging the very foundation of their agreement, forcing him to look past the clauses and contingencies and acknowledge the real, terrifying thing that was growing between them in the shadows of their transactional world. His jaw tightened, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the hard line of his profile. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint, electronic hum of the city far below, a world away from the suffocating intimacy of the office. He finally looked at her, and his slate-grey eyes were no longer empty, but were now a maelstrom of controlled fury and something that looked terrifyingly like panic. "What I want," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to shake the very glass of the windows, "is for you to honor the terms of our agreement. You are a variable I have accounted for. Nothing more." The words were a deliberate cruelty, a final, desperate attempt to reinforce the steel walls she was systematically dismantling with her quiet, unwavering gaze. He was pushing her away with the only tools he had left, his power and his coldness. Ilara did not flinch. She did not retreat. The timid girl who once wiped down sticky tables and counted her tips with trembling hands was gone, burned away by the slow, intense fire of the past few weeks. In her place stood a woman who had seen the wounded ghost behind the billionaire's mask and was no longer afraid of him. She took a deliberate step closer, closing the distance between them until she was standing directly in front of his massive desk, a fragile but unyielding force. "That's not an answer, Damien," she said, her voice soft but imbued with a strength that astonished even herself. "That's an excuse. You can hide behind your money and your contracts, but I see you. I saw you that first night in the diner, and I see you now. You're hiding. I just want to know why." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. A tremor ran through his powerful frame, a visible crack in his iron. Composure. He rose from his chair, not with his usual fluid grace, but with a jagged, abrupt motion like a man waking from a nightmare. He rounded the desk, the polished wood no longer a barrier between them. He was stalking toward her, his face a mask of torment, the battle within him finally spilling over. The cold, calculating tycoon was gone, replaced by a raw, wounded animal, cornered and terrified. He was fighting a war against a decade of self-imposed exile, against the ghost of a past. Love, and against the undeniable, terrifying truth that this quiet, unassuming girl had somehow breached every defense he had ever built. He was losing, and he knew it. He stopped just inches from her, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The air between them was thick, electric, a tangible thing crackling with unspoken desires and unshed tears. The raw hunger she had seen on the terrace that night was back, but now it was unshielded, unmasked, a desperate, drowning plea. He looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving into chaos around him. She saw the years of loneliness etched in the lines around his eyes, the profound grief that had hollowed him out, and in that moment, she was not his contractual fiancée. She was his confessor, his anchor, the only person who had ever bothered to look past the myth and see the man. His hand came up, slow and hesitant, as if he were reaching for a flame, knowing he would be burned. His fingers, which she had only ever seen signing billion-dollar contracts or gripping a steering wheel with white-knuckled control, were trembling as they brushed against her cheek. The touch was a revelation, a jolt of searing heat that shot through her entire body. It was not the touch of a master claiming a possession, but of a starving man being offered bread for the first time in an eternity. His thumb gently traced the line of her jaw, a silent, desperate question. Her eyes fluttered shut, and she leaned into his touch, a complete and unconditional surrender that was not born of weakness, but of a profound, earth-shattering certainty. This was her destiny. This was her ruin. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure agony and release, and then his mouth was on hers. It was not a kiss of gentle romance. It was a desperate, consuming collision, a frantic attempt to erase years of emptiness in a single, searing moment. It was the taste of expensive whiskey, of rain-soaked nights, of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical void. He kissed her with a raw, brutal honesty that stripped away every lie they had told themselves. His arms wrapped around her, one hand tangling in her hair, the other pressing into the small of her back, pulling her flush against the hard lines of his body until there was no space, no air, no separation between them. The fortress of her virginity, built on fear and her mother's warnings, didn't just fall. It was obliterated, reduced to dust. By the force of his desperate, soul-shattering kiss, she met his desperation with her own, her arms circling his neck, her fingers digging into the fine fabric of his shirt as she held on for dear life. This was not a transgression. It was a homecoming. For the first time she felt truly seen, not as a waitress, not as a contractual obligation, but as the one woman who could reach the broken core of him. The kiss gentled, the initial frenzy giving way to a deep, searching intimacy. It became a silent conversation, a language of touch and breath where all their secrets were laid bare. He was asking for forgiveness, for solace, for a reason to believe in something again. And she, with every soft, yielding response of her lips, was telling him yes. Yes, I am here. Yes, I see you. Yes, I am not afraid. He finally broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged and uneven. His eyes, when he opened them, were raw, unguarded, and shimmering with an emotion she had never thought to see in them. Tears. The ghost of Wall Street was gone. In his place was just a man, stripped bare, his heart exposed and bleeding in the dim light of his office. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the depth of the pain and longing in his gaze stole the breath from her lungs. The contract, the money, the entire world outside this room ceased to exist. There was only the fragile, terrifying truth of this connection, a bond forged in a moment of selfless kindness, and now, sealed by a kiss that had irrevocably changed them both. Her name was Annalise, he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. The name hung in the air between them, the ghost he had been chasing for a decade. She was my partner. She built this company with me, and she sold every secret we had to Marcus Thorne. She didn't just break my heart. She tried to erase my existence. He shuddered, a full-body tremor of a memory that was still brutally alive. I swore on her memory that I would never let anyone get close enough to hurt me again. I built an empire of solitude to protect myself. He looked at Ilara, his eyes pleading for her to understand. And then you paid for my dinner with your grandmother's medicine money. You saw through it all. He didn't need to say anything more. She understood. She understood the coldness, the distance, the brutal terms of their contract. They were all just bricks in the fortress he had built around the ruins of his heart. She gently reached up and wiped a single tear from his cheek with her thumb, a gesture of such profound intimacy, it felt more sacred than the kiss itself. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a penitent at a shrine. The transaction was over. The game had ended. In its place was something real, terrifying, and exquisitely fragile. They were no longer a billionaire and a waitress bound by a contract, but two broken people who had found in each other's arms an unexpected and perhaps undeserved sanctuary from the ghosts of their pasts. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, shimmering thing that should have been a bridge, but instead became a chasm. The moment his story was told, the moment his deepest wound was exposed to the light, a visceral terror seized him. The raw, unguarded man who had kissed her with such desperate need vanished, and in his place, the ghost of Wall Street rebuilt his fortress, brick by chilling brick. His hands dropped from her as if she were made of fire. and he took a staggered step back. The warmth in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by the familiar slate-grey coldness that was his armor. "This was a mistake," he stated, his voice flat and devoid of the emotion that had cracked it moments before. The words were a guillotine, severing the fragile connection, leaving Ilara shivering in the sudden, brutal cold of his retreat. The whiplash was dizzying, a violent expulsion from a sacred space. Before she could even process the rejection, he had turned his back on her, pulling his phone from his pocket with a steady hand that betrayed the tremor she had just felt against her skin. "I'm terminating the agreement," he said, not to her, but to the glittering, indifferent city beyond the glass. "My driver will take you wherever you need to go. Your grandmother's care will be endowed, as promised. The rest of the funds will be transferred to an account for you tomorrow." It was a dismissal of surgical precision, a severance package. For a soul, he was reducing their shared intimacy, his own bared heart, to a series of clauses and financial transactions. He was burying the man she had just held under the weight of the billionaire, and in doing so, he was burying her too. Her departure was a surreal, silent film. A stone-faced security guard escorted her to her room, waiting impassively as she numbly gathered her few belongings. She walked past the racks of designer clothes, the silk and cashmere feeling like the costume of a stranger. Her fingers sought the familiar, worn cover of her sketchbook, the only object in this gilded cage that was truly hers. She clutched it to her chest like a shield. The silent ride down in the private elevator was a descent from a fever dream back into the world she knew. As she stepped out of the gleaming, sterile lobby and into the gritty, humid night air of her old life, the city sounds, the distant sirens, the rumble of the subway, felt both alien and achingly familiar. She had been a visitor in a foreign land and was now an exile in her own. The apartment was a time capsule, smelling of lavender, medicinal tea, and a life she no longer fit into. It felt impossibly small, the walls closing in, suffocating her with the ghost of the girl she used to be. A tidal wave of guilt and failure washed over her, so powerful it buckled her knees. She had walked into the lion's den just as her mother had, and she had been devoured. But the ache in her chest wasn't just for her own broken heart. It was the terrifying, gnawing fear that he would change his mind about her grandmother's care, that her one act of defiance had doomed the person she loved most. She saw her mother's weeping face in her mind's eye, heard her warnings echoing in the sudden, crushing silence of the room. She had gambled with her soul and lost everything. Alone in the penthouse that now felt as vast and empty as a mausoleum, Damien was suffocating. The silence was a physical presence, roaring in his ears, amplifying the absence of her quiet energy. He found himself drawn against his will to the sunlit studio he had created for her but had never entered. The scent of charcoal and turpentine hung in the air, a testament to a life being lived, a stark contrast to his own sterile existence. On an easel near the window was a half-finished portrait. It was him, but it wasn't the ruthless tycoon from magazine covers. It was the haunted, solitary man from the diner, his eyes filled with a loneliness so profound it was a physical blow. He stared at the drawing, at the way she had seen past his walls to the prisoner within, and a regret so sharp and deep it felt like a shard of glass in his heart, pierced through his carefully constructed numbness. The days that followed were a study in silence. The money appeared in her bank account as promised, a cold, impersonal sum that felt more like a severance than a gift. It was a final, clear message. He was honoring the letter of their contract while utterly violating its spirit. He wanted her gone. Ilara tried to slip back into her old life, even taking a shift at the diner, but the world had shifted on its axis. The familiar clatter of dishes grated on her nerves, the smell of grease turned her stomach, and the indifferent faces of the customers felt like a personal affront. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of her own past, no longer belonging to the world of cracked linoleum, but irrevocably banished from the world of glass and steel. She was adrift, caught in the desolate space between two shores, belonging nowhere at all. Yet, in the hollowed-out space of her grief, a strange and unfamiliar seed began to sprout. The terror and shame were still there, but beneath them was a new quiet hum of strength. The intimacy she had shared with Damien, however brief and violently concluded, had not destroyed her. It had cracked her open, and through the cracks, a new light was filtering in. She was no longer just the girl who was afraid. She had faced the very thing her mother had warned her against, and had not only survived but had touched something real and profoundly human in the heart of the beast. She opened her sketchbook, her hand no longer hesitant. She didn't draw fantastical landscapes. She drew the storm in Damien's eyes, the raw agony of his confession, the searing memory of his kiss. Her art was no longer an escape. It was a testimony. Her Aunt Carol's phone call was the inevitable. Salt in the wound assault she had been dreading. "So you're back at that dump," her aunt's voice crackled, dripping with vindicated pity. "I knew it. A man like that, he gets what he wants, and then he throws you away. You're just like your mother, a fool for a pretty cage. What did you think was going to happen?" Each word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to reinforce the narrative of her failure. A week ago, the criticism would have shattered her. But now, Ilara listened in silence. Her hand steady, her breathing even. The words no longer had the power to define her. She knew the truth of what had happened in that office was more complex and fragile than her aunt's bitter worldview could ever comprehend. Her silence was not weakness. It was a new, impenetrable shield. In his glass tower, Damien's empire was beginning to reflect his internal chaos. He drove himself and his team with a renewed, merciless ferocity, trying to outrun the memory of Ilara's face, the taste of her lips. But his focus was fractured, his legendary strategic calm shattered. During a critical negotiation with Marcus Thorne, a moment of distraction, a fleeting image of her sad, understanding eyes, caused him to miss a crucial detail, a tell in Thorne's expression. He made a concession he shouldn't have, a small but significant crack in his corporate armor. Thorne, a predator sensing blood in the water, pressed his advantage. Damien realized with a jolt of cold panic that the walls he had built to protect his heart were the same ones that were now blinding him, and the cost of pushing Ilara away was threatening to be the very ruin he had spent a decade trying to avoid. One night, sitting under the dim light of her small desk lamp, Ilara looked at the collection of new drawings scattered before her. They were raw, emotional, and unflinchingly honest. She saw a story in them, not of a poor girl and a rich man, but of two lonely people who had briefly found a mirror in each other's eyes. She realized the fear that had governed her life had been a lie. It wasn't about being broken by a powerful man. It was about being afraid of her own power, the power of her empathy, her passion, her art. She had offered Damien a glimpse of a world without walls, and he had been too afraid to step into it. The sorrow was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was no longer her entire world. With a steady hand, she picked up a fresh sheet of paper. She was no longer the subject of someone else's story. She was ready to draw her own. 3 months had passed, a season turning from the cold memory of winter into the tentative warmth of spring. Ilara had not returned to the diner. The money Damien had left her, which she had initially seen as a brand of shame, became the foundation of her new life. She rented a small third-floor studio in an older part of the city, a space with peeling paint, floors dappled with the ghosts of other artists, and a large, north-facing window that flooded the room with a soft, forgiving light. Here, surrounded by the sharp, clean scent of turpentine and oil paints, she worked with a feverish intensity she had never known. She was preparing for her first gallery show, a collection of raw, unflinching portraits and landscapes from a world of glass and steel. She called the collection The Ghost and the Sparrow, a title that was a secret, a confession, and a final, quiet farewell. The opening night was a blur of soft lighting, the low murmur of conversation, and the clinking of cheap wine glasses. The gallery was small, but the walls were alive with her work. She watched from a shadowed corner as strangers stood before her canvases, their faces thoughtful. They saw the stark, gilded cage of a penthouse office, the turbulent grey of a man's eyes, the desperate intimacy of a single, stolen moment. She had poured all her fear, her desire, and her heartbreak onto the canvas, transforming her pain into something tangible, something beautiful. An elderly woman with kind eyes turned to her, not knowing she was the artist, and whispered, "It's so incredibly sad, and yet so full of hope." In that moment, Ilara felt a profound sense of peace. She had taken their broken story and made it whole, made it hers. Then the world tilted. A figure appeared at the gallery entrance, a silhouette against the deepening twilight, a man who absorbed all the light and sound around him. It was Damien. He was not the titan of industry. She knew, encased in the armor of a bespoke suit. He was dressed in dark jeans and a simple charcoal sweater, his frame looking somehow less imposing, more human. He hesitated in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the room until it landed on the centerpiece of the collection, a life-sized portrait of him as she had first seen him in the diner, a king on a broken throne, his eyes holding an eternity of solitude. His face, illuminated by the gallery lights, was a mask of stunned, painful recognition. He was seeing himself for the first time through her eyes. Their gazes met across the crowded room, and a profound electric silence fell between them, a bubble in the stream of time. The low hum of the gallery, the city outside, everything vanished. In his eyes she saw none of the cold calculation or the guarded emptiness she had come to expect. Instead, she saw a raw, unguarded vulnerability, a deep, aching regret that was so palpable it felt like a physical blow. He did not smile, did not move toward her, did not offer any gesture of reconciliation. He simply stood there, a ghost at the feast, and allowed her to see the wreckage inside him. It was a silent, devastating apology, an admission that the fortress he had built had cost him the only thing of value that had ever breached its walls. He was finally, truly unarmed. In that silent, suspended moment, Ilara felt the last of her fear dissolve, replaced by a quiet, steady strength. She had survived him. She had survived the fall. She knew he had come not to reclaim her, but to bear witness to the story she had told, to the truth he could no longer deny. She offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, nor an invitation to return. It was an acknowledgement. It was closure. It said, "I see you. I survived, and I am free." A flicker of something, relief, perhaps even gratitude, crossed his face. He held her gaze for a beat longer, a final silent farewell, before turning and melting back into the night from which he came, leaving her standing whole and unbroken in a room full of her own creation. The last of the guests departed, leaving Ilara alone in the quiet gallery, surrounded by the ghosts she had painted. The city lights glittered through the large front window, no longer a symbol of an unattainable world, but simply the beautiful, complex backdrop to her own. She walked to the portrait of Damien, her fingers gently tracing the rough texture of the dried paint on the canvas. Their story had not been a fairy tale. It had been a crucible, one that had burned away the timid girl she was and forged the artist she was becoming. She did not know what her future held, only that it was a blank canvas, and for the first time in her life she was the one holding the brush. Their connection was not an ending, but a beginning, proof that some souls enter our lives not to stay, but to change us forever. If you believe in the power of art to heal and a story's ability to transform us, we invite you to subscribe, like, and share your own journey in the comments below.